All the videos? Okay. That was very fast. Welcome, everyone. This is track 4, translating data into actionable insights. I would like to welcome both our in-person audience as well as our virtual audience. The session for this hour is the path to more trusted data. Like, who doesn't want trusted data? So you're going to hear from Ryan on how to get to the path to trusted data. You know, as company like yours begin to democratize data at scale across the organization, it is critical to ensure that siloed data processes are not eroding trust in your business. Highly publicized data breaches, coupled with unethical applications of data making headlines, are demanding the need for privacy-enhancing technologies. In addition to that, there is a shift in the market toward unified data intelligence solutions and programs that embed privacy and compliance as part of your business processes, as part of your culture, as well as part of your technology. So in this session, we will address how can you scale and deliver insights with the application of privacy-enhancing technology and machine learning to classify and protect your data and also manage your data policies at scale. How can you enable the data consumers within your organization to find and access trusted data at scale? Before I introduce the speaker, a few housekeeping details from my side. This session is being recorded and it will be made available with your registration at no additional cost. We also have virtual audience joining us, so we'll have questions from the virtual audience. So live audience, please raise your hand if you have a question at the end of the presentation. And virtual audience, please submit your questions via Hua app Q&A tab. With that, our speaker today is Ryan Edge. Ryan is a Director of Strategy, Privacy, and Data Governance at OneTrust. In his role, Ryan advises clients on how to transform privacy and compliance into trusted and ethical use of data. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, and hello everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming out. I think we've got an interesting session for you today, and would love to hear at the end some of the questions that opens up, both in the room and online. We'll save some time for that. So let me make sure my clicker works here. As mentioned, my name is Ryan Edge. I lead our product strategy team at OneTrust, really focused on our privacy and data governance offerings. OneTrust does a lot more beyond that. We are a company that is, as mentioned in the intro, really focused on helping organizations become more trusted and be really intelligent about how they do that. That includes things like privacy and data governance, but also goes much beyond that. And we'll talk about some of those things today in the presentation. So to kick it off, you've seen trust a lot and heard the word trust a lot, even in the 3 minutes we've all been sitting in this room. So what is trust really? And I'm not going to sit here and try to define trust for you, because we could have arguments over what is trust, how do you define it all day. But I think we all know that we can say when we trust a person, when we trust an organization, and when we don't. We know that feeling of trust. And what I'm really going to tell you is why trust is important and why it's important today and something that all organizations need to be thinking about. And that is really because trust is driving what we see as sort of the next decade of growth and competitive differentiation that organizations are going through. So if you think back a couple decades, a lot of organizations, maybe organizations like yours, would differentiate themselves in the market from their competitors based on the price and the quality of their products. And that was kind of it. That was the main focus of how one business might have been successful versus another. As time evolved, so did organizations, and you started to see things like the experience and the engagement and the interaction you got with a company becoming more important. It wasn't just that price, that quality, still very important, but you started to see more aspects of this. And where we're at today with today's generation of, whether it's consumers, whether it's your employees, individuals care much more about trust and transparency than they have in the past. An organization, or excuse me, individuals will make decisions on how they engage with organizations. Do they buy products or services from them? Do they go work for that company? Based on whether or not they feel that that organization is transparent and trusted in their eyes. Now, that's not to say that these other aspects are no longer important. They, of course, are. But trust and transparency are more important than ever for a business. And there's a ton of metrics. We'll show you some throughout the presentation. But today, 70% of consumers say that trusting a brand is more important to them today than it might have been in the past. And there are a lot of things that are driving that. There we go. There are a lot of fundamental things happening in the world and regulations and technology that are driving the importance of trust. If you think about things happening in society, the reputation of a brand, stakeholder capitalism, things like the talent war, right? Trust is more important than ever to drive the success of your business. We all are probably pretty familiar with regulatory trends, right? There are always regulations that drive a lot of these different components of trust. You've got privacy regulation, marketing regulation, you've got whistleblower regulation in the EU. You've got all these types of things that come together to drive urgency and clarity on what do I need to do by when, but are not really the fundamental drivers of this. And then finally, I think something that a lot of the folks in this room probably resonate a lot with is the technology changes that are driving this. And I think we can boil this down to, there's really three key ones that always jump out in conversations, which are the emergence of big data and analytics and how easy it is today to aggregate more and more data in different ways to drive insights for your organization. There are things like the Internet of Things, which is bringing new types of data and more sensitive data into organizations to leverage and use for different purposes. And then all of this type of data is getting fed into new ways of use through AI and ML. And we have to be very conscious of the privacy and ethical concerns that are related to that type of use of information. So all of this starts to drive trust. Now, this session is called The Path to More Trusted Data. Understand, in a room with people who make it, their day-to-day and everything they do is focused around data. Trusted data can mean different things. And a lot of times it might mean, okay, how is my data trusted by, my internal stakeholders, right? The parts of the business that I serve, my internal customers, if you will, to ensure that they have data that they trust when they go and use that within the business. Very important, but I want to shift our focus to think more of this as being phrased, the path to trusted data use. And that piece I just mentioned is fundamental. It's important there, right? The business needs to trust the data, but especially when you think about things like personal data, other stakeholders, individuals whose data that is, need to trust how you're using that data. And so that's what I want to really focus on as we go through the presentation today. And why this is important is because it drives fundamental business outcomes. There's been a lot of research done over this, on this over the past couple years from organizations like Edelman, BCG, that have come up with clear outcomes that trust is a competitive advantage for an organization, and that when people trust you, when individuals trust you, they're more likely to pay a premium for your goods or services, they're more likely to share their data with you, and they're more loyal. They're going to keep coming back. So that's why trust and the role that data really plays into that is very important for organizations like yours. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the specifics and the how behind this. So how do you build trust through your data governance programs within your organization? And we're going to talk about this in 4 key areas today. The first, we're going to talk about data privacy. So how does privacy really help you to build trust, and how does that overlap and influence your data governance? We're going to talk about individual choice. This is a bit of a subset of that first one, right? But how do you ensure that you're treating how an individual tells you they want their data used as a fundamental data policy that you need to honor within your organization? We're going to talk a little bit about ESG. This is a huge buzzword, I think, probably at this conference and the market in general right now. Every board in every industry is starting to think about ESG and how do you define initiatives and report on and demonstrate that you're accountable in areas around ESG. And then finally, we're going to talk about data ethics. So we mentioned how AI and machine learning are continuing to emerge, and are creating ethical concerns. So as data teams, how do you start to respond to that, and how do you enable your organization to continue to grow in that area, but do it in a safe and ethical way? So these are the 4 different pieces we're going to talk about today and go into additional detail here. So let's dive into the first. Let's talk about data privacy. So there are really, I like to point out 3 key challenges that are closely related to the ones we talked about that are influencing all of this trust transformation, if you will. But these really dive into challenges that organizations are facing from a privacy perspective. There is a massive increase in the regulatory complexity, no matter what type of organization you are. If you're a global organization, you've got all these different laws across different countries. If you're just a local organization here in the US, well, we've got 5 state privacy laws that are going into effect at the start of 2023, which take us from really just 1 today in California. Brings into scope 4 additional states and expands the requirements of California. Now, with every challenge comes opportunity, right? This gives organizations an opportunity to stop being so reactive when it comes to privacy laws. It's like, okay, a new law came out, a new law came out, a new law came out. What are the requirements? How do I react? Well, you can take a more best practice-driven global approach that keeps you from being so reactive and embeds better privacy and better governance of personal data just into your principles as an organization. There's that evolving data and technology landscape. A lot of that evolution is focused on use of personal data, which directly impacts privacy programs. So that challenge gives you the opportunity as an organization to, instead of making privacy sort of a compliance layer that sits on top of your business, how do you just embed it directly into your data operations, truly embedding privacy by design and by default? And then the final one, which I think is probably one of the most interesting, is, privacy is about people, right? And there is an increased awareness of all your stakeholders, whether it's consumers, customers, employees, on a couple things. Their rights when it comes to their personal data, and also they're more aware of the sometimes sketchy things that organizations might be doing with their personal data. And that drives a huge opportunity to take that increased awareness and turn it into trust through giving those individuals transparency, control over their data, which we'll talk even more about in a minute. So what this all kind of sums up to is that personal data can be the most valuable type of data that you have, but it can also be the riskiest. And so there has to be really a dedicated focus on personal information and how it is governed within your organization. Now, this is driving a fundamental evolution in privacy. Privacy is not a tick-the-box compliance exercise. It can't be. That's how a lot of organizations started thinking about it, right? When 5 years ago, the organizations are starting to think about, okay, this privacy thing, the GDPR is going into effect. A lot of what happened is, okay, well, how do I just get out of spreadsheets, but still, I'm just doing kind of a legal compliance activity that's out of date as soon as I finish it. What this is evolving to be, to really be able to do privacy and to do it in a way that engenders trust, is it's evolving beyond just those regulatory compliance initiatives. Yes, you still have to do that. You still have to build all the reports that you have to show to a regulator. You still have to have those functions built in, but it's much more connected to the data. It's much more a data governance initiative than just a legal and compliance initiative. It's about that integrated governance of personal data, and it's about helping individuals trust the way that you're using their data. And this has been proven to be valuable by organizations. So this is a report that Cisco generated, a privacy benchmarking study. Super interesting. You guys should check it out if you haven't read it. But they've released this, I think, a few years in a row now. But they basically are showing through research that investment in the maturity of privacy programs generates ROI for the business. Now you can see that there's incremental gain as you get more and more mature here, but especially if you're way behind your peers, your other organizations that are similar to you, other organizations that an individual might interact with, you're really going to see the effects of this. And what maturity means a lot of times from a privacy program is taking it beyond that tick the box compliance exercise and embedding it into how you use that data throughout your organization. Now, that's great, but how do you start to do this, right? How is always the key point here. So to start to address these things, you really need to be thinking about purpose-built technology that is taking the context of privacy and personal data into account. And there are a few different things that I'm going to call out that I think every organization who is trying to be mature and robust in this area should be thinking about. First, you can't do this without real-time information, right? A lot of ways, again, that privacy programs started were manual assessments, out of date as soon as you finish it, et cetera. You've got to have real-time information to be able to be transparent with an individual about how you're using their data. This takes technology like automated data discovery and classification. So how do you just know what you have, right? How you're using it when it comes to personal data. What's really interesting about, again, privacy and personal data is you've got to go deeper than the metadata layer, right? It is about understanding that person's data, right? So instead of saying, oh, I know I'm capturing social security number in this system, it's, I know that I'm capturing Kelsey's social security number in this system because I might need to know that if Kelsey wants to take action on her data and delete it or get access to it. So taking data discovery and understanding your data to the next level. It's important to have enhanced data context, right? Metadata, understanding your data is super important. What privacy requires is having some regulatory intelligence around this. California is a great example. The new law coming out there, the CPRA, creates an entirely new classification of personal data called sensitive personal information. Wasn't defined under the CCPA, and it has to be handled differently. You have to give somebody the ability to opt out of it. And for that same type of data in Virginia, somebody has to opt in before you can use it. So you really have to understand the context of, okay, I'm processing this data. I'm doing stuff like discovery and classification to help me understand how I'm using data. But what's the context from a regulatory perspective? What do I need to do to make sure I'm following these privacy principles? The other thing is thinking about program automation, right? So it's great to understand all of this, but then there are ways that you have to act, right? There are different things you have to do. You have to, like I said, generate the right reporting, et cetera. But one of the key things that we see organizations struggling with a lot of times is fulfilling things like privacy rights requests. You might hear privacy rights requests, individual rights requests, DSAR requests. It's all the same thing. Pretty much every privacy regulation requires that. And it's basically saying, the individual whose data I'm processing, they have rights against that data to opt out of certain things, to limit the use of it in certain ways, to correct it, to access it, to delete it. So you need to be able to automate that or you're going to get, especially if something bad happens, right? Say you have a breach. Say there's some bad press out there about your organization. A lot of times that's going to cause upticks in these requests, and it becomes very hard to do that in a manual process. So how do you have that program automation? And the final piece I'll mention is, I kind of harped on this in the beginning, but integration into your data lifecycle, right? This can't all just happen independent of how your organization's using data, how you're enabling the business to use data. It's got to be embedded. And this is really where I think the concept of privacy by design starts to be taken into account. And that's really going to lead into the next topic directly is how do you start to design that into your entire data lifecycle? And one of the really key pieces that a lot of organizations miss or haven't matured to yet is thinking about the individual's choice and how their data is used. This is about letting the individual know how you are or how you plan to use the data that you're capturing about them, and giving them control over how you're able to do that, helping them tell you when they don't want their data used in one way versus the other. And this ties directly back to that third challenge I mentioned for privacy within an organization of this is that ability to be more transparent, give more control, to really drive and turn the awareness of all those individuals into trust between that individual and your organization, developing a better long-term relationship. So I'll give an example here. So I always call this the creepy or cool conundrum. So who here has ever had an experience where they were talking to their friends, family, where, you know, maybe you're talking about, oh, like we should really go on a ski trip to Breckenridge next year. And then 20 minutes later, you're scrolling Instagram and you're like, I just got an ad from Breckenridge. And you're like, how did that happen? I think we've all experienced things like that. And you're like, is my phone listening to me? You know, who knows? But there's a perception of something like that that's very individual, right? Different people feel different ways about that. I might think getting an ad for something at a cheaper price is great. I was looking for that anyway. Someone else might think, whoa, that's really creepy, like what I just mentioned, and not want that. And Forrester did a lot of research on this. You can see some quotes of how basically different people feel different way about this. But the one in the middle always sums it up best for me in that people want these types of experiences from companies, but only when they ask for it and on their terms. So how do you make sure you are continuing to, and this is obviously a very small like marketing use case, right? But how do you make sure you're continuing to enable the business to do the things it needs to do to differentiate, be successful, and provide great experiences to the people that, the stakeholders of your business, but while doing it on their terms? And the beauty of this is oftentimes it's perceived that these two things are at odds. But privacy and data use, personalization don't have to be at odds, right? This is a study that was done by Adobe, another great report to check out if you all haven't seen it, their trust report from this year. And if you look at the top right metric, metrics like this are funny a lot of times because you'll see ones that are like 80% of consumers care about the privacy of their data. It's like, yeah, of course they do. But the top right one here I thought was super interesting, and 72% of the consumers they surveyed said that the relevant content delivered at the right time and the right way to them actually increased their trust with the organization. So that's not saying, oh, someone cares about their privacy. Of course they do. But that's actually saying that if you do this right, there is value to be had for your brand and for your organization. So again, important, but how do you start to think about this, and how does this touch what you all do every day? Well, we're saying that it's ultimately transparency and choice over this information that can lead to this continued use of data, but doing that in a way that builds trust with individuals. And where this starts is with data capture. So when you're collecting data directly from individuals, and of course, you aggregate data in many different ways, right? Might be in a third-party manner, might be in a first-party manner that's directly from the consumers that you target, for example. But starting with that data capture and doing that in the right way is hugely important. From there, when we think about a lot of the ways that personal information is used, there's lots of reasons you can use that information, right? Maybe you have a contract you have to fulfill with that individual. You got to use the information to do that. But a lot of times, especially in the marketing areas and things like that, you're doing that based on that individual's consent, right? Did they say you could use data for this particular purpose? Yes or no? And you should use data that way. So how do you actually capture that information when you're capturing their information and enforce that and govern your data based on that downstream? And that ultimately leads to that privacy, consent of that individual being embedded by default so that you're using that data in a trusted way. And transparency, being very clear to them how you plan to use this information, is sort of the glue that ties all that together. So the way to start thinking about this is really directly tied to what I mentioned about data capture. You all might be familiar with the shift left philosophy in security, but think about that for data governance. A lot of organizations will start trying to govern data once it's already in their system. And again, still really focusing on that idea of personal data that you might be gathering from an individual. That comes into your data ecosystem. It gets put into all of these different, CRMs or data lakes, all these different systems, and you start trying to govern it after it's all spread out, right? It's like trying to put ink back in the bottle. The best time to start, especially with a use case like this, is how do you understand the purpose for which that data can and should be used and was agreed to right at the start, right? Right when you get that data, and permeate that, tag that, pass that throughout your entire data ecosystem so that when someone's going to access that data, they either can or they can't based on what that individual told you in the first place. you're actually respecting the idea of consent, not just documenting it to say, okay, I documented consent for this regulator. So super interesting way to think about that. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, again, when you are engaging with individuals, this is a very consumer-driven perspective, but this could be employees as well. A lot of times employee engagement's much more driven on that fact that you have a contract with them, they're an employee, but you might have elective programs with employees that they opt into and things like that. But if you think about a consumer perspective, there's a journey. There's a lot of different ways that people interact with your organization, with your brand. They go to your website, you're tracking them through different types of tracking technologies. Maybe they're subscribing to newsletters, they're on your mobile app, calling your call center, they're updating their marketing preferences. How do you bring that all into a singular, unified, and most importantly, transparent user experience where at each of these touch points, they're very clear that, one, why they got that type of communication, why XYZ happened, and two, how they can make an update, and they're confident that you're going to respect that update that they make. And how that actually gets respected is after individuals come to you, engage with you in these different ways, they're changing permissions, they're changing choices, preferences, they're giving you more data, they're asking you to delete data. How do you actually honor all of that across your data lifecycle, your data ecosystem? People are opting in, opting out, making these individual rights requests. That's got to pass through all of your different systems where that data is stored. So this is really the crux of completing that life cycle of transparency and choice is actually respecting that. And so what does that look like? How do you do that? I always like to think of this as this idea of consent is an individual's data policy, right? It's a very specific way that they're saying, hey, you can have my data, company, but you need to use it in only these ways that we've agreed to within our engagement as consumer and organization. So thinking about how do you tie use policies to user choice. So for example, maybe someone says it's okay to use their data for marketing, but they don't want you to share it with third parties. So if you've got all this data aggregated into a data lake that lots of different types of people can access, how do you make sure only the right people can access that? And how do you make sure that when somebody does make a request or when the retention period kicks in where you no longer need their data for whatever reason, you're actually enforcing those types of things? That is what ultimately can help drive that trust between you and that individual, drive more trusted data use, and you embed compliant, trusted use by default, right? This is one of the areas where a lot of times organizations think privacy and implementing a lot of these things is going to slow the business down. Well, if you don't embed it by default, it might. If you embed it by default, when somebody's going in, accessing, using data, it's already been put through the process, the governance process, to where you know that they can use it for the reason that they're even able to access it. If you don't do that, well, that's when maybe your privacy team is going to say, oh, wait, we need to do a PIA, or they need to fill out this assessment before they can use data in that way. Now, that's what will slow the business down. So being proactive and embedding all this by default really drives those outcomes for your business. It can enable you to have more focused and quality and valuable data that the business is going to get more value out of and drive these better outcomes. And it can also build a recognizable value exchange with that individual. They understand what data they gave you, understood that you used it in a way that they agreed to, and they got some value out of that in return. That's what ultimately builds that underlying trust.
Excuse me, I don't quite understand. Can you give a real-life example of how to do that? Like, say, put the policy in force, like in the data warehouse?
Yeah, so that's actually exactly what I was going to go to next. So let me give you an example of this. So I think a lot of organizations have. You might be doing these today. You might have done these as part of your digital transformation, but implementing these data lakes, data warehouses to give your organization a better place to go and access and use data. So how do you make sure that what I just mentioned, and to your question, consent gets respected in that? So let's say you already have an individual's data in, like, I think the example I use here is Snowflake. You got a Snowflake data lake. You've already got an individual's data in that. And in that data lake, you give access to your marketing teams. You give access to your third-party partners as well. So you've got an individual that changes how they want their data to be used. So they say, I'm okay with data being shared with you, company, for marketing purposes, but not with your third-party partners. They make that update through some sort of preference center that tells you as an organization that's how they feel. So what needs to happen, the flow of things, right, through whatever technology that you have to implement this, is you need to update the record for that person, a consent record to say, because it's not just that data lake, right? It's probably other systems as well. You need to have a central record that says that person has opted out of use of their data for this purpose, which is sharing with third-party partners. What happens from there is by having a central consent platform, that can connect to the system where the data is processed. So for example, let's say it's Snowflake. It might be others, it probably is, but it connects to Snowflake. You can drive integration between those two systems. So the system that says, okay, I know this person opted out, I'm connected to the preference center where they did so. I know that they opted out of this particular type of use of their data. So what that can do is actually call Snowflake and apply technology that these data lakes like Snowflake have built to mask data in certain ways. So they have a policy called row masking, which can basically say, let's say it's me, Ryan, I opted out. It can say, Ryan opted out, find Ryan in Snowflake his record, and mask that record for people who can access it based on the user role. So if my role is that of a third party who has access to Snowflake, I'm not going to see Ryan. But if I'm a marketing person internal to the organization, because Ryan's still okay with me using his data that way, I'm still gonna see that information. So that's an example, and like one of the frankly common use cases we see with our customers at OneTrust of how this has started to be implemented to drive that sort of consent-based governance and privacy, personal data governance by default as your organization is actually using this information. Okay, just making sure we keep moving along here and stay on track here. So those are both very privacy related, personal data related, right? Another really interesting topic that we're hearing across individuals like you in the market is the impact of ESG. ESG is a super broad thing, right? Environmental, social, and governance. A lot of different types of operations within an organization can funnel up into ESG, but ultimately ESG is something that, because of the importance of trust, right, and because, like I said, a lot of consumers, a lot of employees, a lot of stakeholders, even like investors, are going to engage with an organization, buy their products, work for them, invest in them, based on these practices that are very, very related to trust. Do they treat people right? Do they treat the planet right? All of these types of things. ESG is a massive topic for a lot of organizations. Get some water real quick. Now, what we're finding through a lot of the discussions we have with our customers is that ESG is a data problem a lot of times. And what I mean by that is you've got, your CEO, your board making these commitments on ESG. Maybe that's carbon, sustainability commitments, DE&I commitments. But you've got to be able to, one, understand like what are you doing today so you know what kind of commitment you're going to make to get better. And then you've got to be able to demonstrate that you're actually executing against that. And that becomes a problem of like, do you have the right data? So think about a lot of the key things that might make up an ESG program or different ESG initiatives. You've got carbon metrics. This can be all kinds of stuff, right? This can be like if you're a company that has physical utilities, what's your usage of your like cloud and data center impact? What's the impact of people within your organization traveling to go do business on the environment? What's the impact of your third parties? You're using third parties to grow your business. You're growing their business. What's their impact on the environment, for example? This can be DE&I metrics, right? So what's your racial, ethnic diversity within your organization, gender diversity, age diversity, all these things that, that companies might make commitments on. There are impacts around what we just talked about, around privacy and data ethics, and sensitive personal information is often about things like DE&I, and how are you doing that and providing the right opt-out mechanisms. And then it's so broad that it's a bunch of other things that you do for governance within your organization. Broader data governance, security, risk, third-party risk, ethics and compliance. So the challenge here is that how do you get all of this information together and report on it and have the intelligence needed to build a program around this? And what we're hearing is that data teams are often getting asked to help understand all this information, right? How do I go and find all of these details so that I can have the right metrics, and how do I pull that into a BI layer to help me demonstrate success of this? So we're starting to really hear that about ESG driving a lot of focus from some data teams as well. Is anybody in the room working on projects like this within their organization? I got one. All right. Two. Okay. And we got some shy people. That's okay. So look, the one thing I'll say is this is early days, right? This is still a very it's a very hot topic, but it's also immature market, right? It's what does all this mean? But this is a lot of what we're seeing investment being put around, and you likely have a team that owns this program, but they're going to need the right data to be able to manage this program. So that's one piece, right, is data teams helping with these types of projects. The other piece is just general use of data in a more macro level, right? So, there's been a ton of digital transformation, digitalization, but is that a good thing for the environment, for the climate, or bad, right? So the net of this is there is an impact, right? And a growing impact as more and more data is processed of just volumes of data impacting climate and the environment. So this is the other role that data teams might play within their organization. It's that more data isn't always better. More data isn't always the right answer. So when we see organizations start to focus on these types of initiatives, there are a few key steps. And I always focus on environmental sustainability, carbon accounting, because that's the most common thing that people think of when they think of ESG. Like I said, much broader than that, but that's a really common thing that organizations have started to focus on. And so to start running a program like that, you've got to do a few things. You've got to be able to calculate what are you doing today. You've got to then build a strategy and be able to start to reduce your impact. And then there are other things you can do, like doing offsets. So investing in other renewable energies, things like that might offset your use of carbon. Now, data teams' roles in this fall into a couple places. The first I already talked a little bit about, right? It's helping calculate that. Calculating and defining your carbon footprint, for example, so that you can run these programs, very difficult. You've got to understand, just like you might have a data asset inventory or catalog within your organization, well, what's your inventory of these activities that might impact your carbon footprint? Like I said earlier, do you have factories? Do you have third parties who are involved? Do you have individuals, employees who are traveling, making an impact on behalf of your business? How do you inventory that? Then how do you collect all of your data? How do you go pull the data from all your utility providers to understand the carbon impact of that? How do you pull it from your travel and expense tool to understand the impact of all the flights that were taken for business? How do you bring all of these things together? It's a data discovery problem in a slightly different way. And then you got to be able to take that, aggregate the metrics, and make decisions on it, right? So how do you translate all that information into what your actual footprint is? This is very different based on different standards and frameworks as well. And then the organization's going to need a layer to be able to track this and show, where were we at the beginning of 2023 when we made this commitment? And, we said we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. How do we actually work towards that and demonstrate that. So again, this is where data teams might be pulled in from that calculation perspective. The other piece is everybody in the organization plays a factor in the reduce part, right? If we're going to make a commitment, how do we start to reduce that? Well, this is where we can start to think about things like data minimization. But instead of data minimization, I like to think about it more in terms of data optimization, excuse me. It's not necessarily this, goal to minimize, need to use less data, use less data. It's more about how do I make sure I'm capturing and using the right data? And if I've got stuff that's useless that nobody's touched in 10 years, like I need to get rid of that. So how do you start to think about data optimization? And this is a principle that drives benefits and drives influence from a lot of different parts of your organization. Privacy teams need to do this because they're a core part of every privacy law. Security teams, they want to minimize data because it decreases the data footprint, reduces attack surface and risk of breach. Excuse me. Marketing teams, they get benefit out of this as well. That might sound like something marketing teams are never going to say, right? But if they have less data, but it's more optimized, more quality, more first party, if you will, they know it's accurate, they know it's going to drive the insights they need, they're not going to be upset that they have less of it. Like I said, ESG and sustainability teams or whoever's running these programs, well, they're trying to just reduce the carbon footprint of the organization, which more data contributes to. And IT, they can spend less if there's less data. So this idea of data optimization is another role that data teams play within this ESG ecosystem. And so this means really being more efficient and optimized when you're serving the organization. And it's about not necessarily having more data, but just having the right data and giving the right access to that to the right people at the right time. So that's some of the impacts we're seeing ESG and those initiatives have on data teams, and also, of course, how they drive that top line value of trust. Now, the final piece we'll go into is talking a little bit more about data ethics. The big thing here is AI and machine learning, right? And I always think of data ethics as there's a lot of laws and policies, whether that's a regulation, a law, an internal policy you have for data within your organization that are telling you, how you can use data. You can only use data in this way. It's only allowed to use data in this way. That doesn't always, some things can sneak through there and still cause you problems with data ethics. Data ethics is about how should I be doing this, right? It's what's the right way to do it. It's a ethical principle, not necessarily a line in the sand. And so that makes it harder as well because it's less about that defined requirement and more about these principles that you might have to think about within your organization. So what's driving a lot of this is, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but analytics, AI, they're easier than ever to use and deploy, right? You've got these platforms that let you use data in a much more broad way, but you also have vendors that you can work with who are already building a lot of this AI for you. So it's more easy to use AI than it ever is before. And AI can be great, right? AI is awesome, solves super hard problems. It can help save the planet, right, through different environmental approaches. It can help us solve huge health problems and identify health problems early so that people can be, treated earlier. We use it in our technology to help you more accurately discover and classify data. It can be used in all kinds of business contexts. So AI is great. AI can also cause a lot of problems for an organization, right? So, we've always all seen these different headlines that come out of AI being used in the wrong way. One story that I heard recently was in Microsoft Teams, there's AI detection that will, if two people talk at one time, they'll mute one person. And it turned out that they were muting females, almost every time over males when it talked at the same time. So, things like that there's gender bias in that algorithm, right? And we see that all the time. And Gartner put some metrics around this saying that 85% of AI projects will provide false results caused by bias through 2030. meaning basically organizations are starting to use a lot of this technology but don't necessarily have a handle on the governance around it. So AI is awesome, right? But with great power comes great responsibility. Pretend we've got the like Spider-Man meme up here. So a lot of things can be driven from this, right? Bias. AI really makes decisions based on the data it's trained on, right? And so if it's trained on biased data, then so will the result will also be biased. AI also amplifies decisions, right? So if you have a little problem, it turns into a big problem when AI gets involved. And that algorithm learns and develops over time. And then drift also occurs when that algorithm is run many, many times. The initial outputs that you test might seem fine, but as that scales and it learns, it might create additional bias or concerns over time. So really focusing on explainability and consistency of those algorithms, of those outputs over time is critical, and you have to demonstrate that, right? So AI is, I'll say, on the forefront of being governed more heavily. It's kind of like how we saw privacy a few years ago, where it was like, okay, there's not a lot of governance, regulation, I should say, around how personal data is used. That's changed drastically in the last 5 years. We're starting to see AI kind of get to that point as well, where you've got different regions around the world looking at different ways to regulate the use of AI. There's a lot of best practices, standards, frameworks out there already that can be used. But this is a good thing that starts to help you understand how are others doing this and how can this data be used in the right way and these technologies be used in the right way. But this is another one that it's a tough problem, right? You start to think about, okay, I've got AI that I'm using that maybe I built these models internally. Maybe I'm using something from a vendor. I'm just kind of pointing it at these giant data sets. I don't necessarily know what's happening. Like, how do I go and solve that? Well, like any big problem, you get started one foot in front of the other. And there's a lot of principles you've used in other parts of your organization and your governance programs that you can use here. First, create a central inventory of how you're using AI. A lot of the companies I talk to, they don't even have like a central view or handle on all the places this is being used. Like I mentioned, it's easier than ever, right? Maybe somebody had access to, run a big data set through some AI provided in your Azure instance or something like that as they were building some sort of internal application. If you don't have the right, governance around that process, this might start to be used in ways you don't even know it's being used. So how do you create that central kind of process and inventory around what are my projects, data sets, models that I'm using within my organization? The next, screen went away. There we go. The next piece is, again, kind of a back to basics approach of do a risk assessment, right? There's a lot of best practices, principles out there that you can assess this against. Define a data ethics, standard and code that you have within your organization. And when somebody's going to request the use of AI for a project, how do you assess the risk of that? Take a risk-based approach to whether that should even move forward or not. From there, you can start to get more, I'll say, advanced in this and think about things like how do you analyze the training data sets that are going into your AI models? This goes back to discovery and classification technology, right? If you go deeper than metadata and you can analyze data that's actually in these big data sets that might be used for this, you can start to identify trends. You can start to say, oh, maybe there's a higher volume of individuals who are male versus female, one race, ethnicity versus another, that can predict some of these issues that you might start to have in the ongoing use of this AI. And then from there, it's monitoring the outcomes over time, right? So how do you make sure that those things aren't drifting? So this is a common kind of phased approach, crawl, walk, run, if you will, that we'll see a lot of organizations taking in this area. All right, so I think we've got 10 minutes left. We talked through these 4 key areas. So what I'm going to do is just tell you real quick a little bit about who OneTrust is, how we help with this, and then I'll open it up for questions for the remaining time. But OneTrust is an organization, we think a lot about what we talked about today of trust. And how do we help organizations be intelligent about trust and become more trusted and unify a lot of those workflows and teams and views into data within an organization. Now, specifically within privacy and data governance, we focus on that principle of helping you make that evolution of, privacy is not just about compliance, but it's about the governance of personal data. And we do that by supporting a lot of what we talked about today. So the first piece is we help you give individuals control over their data and be more transparent with individuals on how their data is used. This is done through techniques to capture more first-party data, to enable consent and preferences, and to enable individuals and you as an organization to fulfill these privacy rights, DSAR type requests if it gets to that point in a more efficient way. That's kind of the front end, right? It's your curb appeal of your privacy and governance program, if you will. We also help you with the back end, right? Compliance and risk management, though it's not everything when it comes to privacy and the governance of personal data, it's still important. And so we help you operationalize those different workflows. And then we also help you embed privacy into how you govern and use data. So how do we make sure that when you're capturing consent, it is passed into your data warehouse, your data lake? How do we make sure that you are only keeping data for as long as you should when it comes to that? And then we underpin this by really two things. The first is automated intelligence. So doing that deep beyond metadata discovery and classification. We have a giant team of regulatory experts that builds a lot of regulatory intelligence into our product so that you can track compliance against regulations. You can also understand, okay, for these types of data, what are the regulatory implications for using that in certain ways? And then we also can feed this into different trust centers for your different stakeholders so that you can drive that transparency. Now, this is just one piece of our broader platform, which is focused on what we call trust intelligence. And that is bringing together privacy and data governance, your broader GRC, risk management, security assurance programs within your organization, as well as ethics and compliance, and this emerging field of ESG and sustainability. So we talked about how principles, things that you might have to work on as data teams, can often go across all of these different pillars and all these different teams within your organization. So we really focus on unifying views into data, workflows, all of these things, so you don't have all 5 different teams trying to accomplish the same thing and each having their own set of technology to do this. So that's what we're really focused on as an organization. It's what we do. This is what we focus on. It's all we do. We're really pioneering in this area. We help over 12,000 customers do this. We have over 25,000 employees that support our customers and have a huge focus of those employees in product and R&D because this is a constantly evolving market and we know it takes technology to solve it. And so, we truly are a focused technology company and we have a large community because of those customers and practitioners that, help support our customer base on this as well. So if you want to hear more, we've got Kelsey and David up here who have some data sheets they can pass out to you, some collateral. We've got a booth downstairs. Would love to talk to you all more, and I'll hang out here afterwards as well. And with that, I'll say thanks. Connect with me on LinkedIn if you'd like, and I'll take some questions.
Let me start with the virtual audience question. What are some of the common barriers to enabling trust in an organization? How do you think companies can overcome that?
I think the hardest thing a lot of times is, I kind of framed it up, right? Trust is a big thing with a lot of different definitions. It means different things to different people. It means different things within different organizations. So it's almost a where do you start, right? Focus on specific initiatives because trust is going to be very broad across very different teams within your organization with very focused initiatives of their own that they're working on. So maybe some of the things that we talked about today can be kind of a starting point depending on where your organization is. But I think that barrier can oftentimes just be trust can be a higher level concept instead of a very specific project that's being done or a specific, I've got to go mitigate these risks by this date. So you've really got to have a cross-functional goal and project that is not all of trust, but a portion of it that you can focus on, I think is a lot of times the best way to start getting cross-functional alignment. And it's always great if that project has like really good metrics around it to show success, and if it can really drive those ROI type metrics. So, we talked about the consent piece. If you're like, hey, an initiative for us is we know we don't have a good handle on personal data, and we know that we're not taking individual choice into account, how can I run a project that helps do that, even if it's smaller scale? I just implemented a data lake. I'm implementing a data lake. How do I focus on that particular project, that piece, embed that in, and start to show some of the value? Maybe more efficient access to data because privacy is not getting involved after the fact, asking someone, hey, why do you want this? How do you start to show those ROIs and kind of break down those potential barriers that might exist?
Any questions from the audience here?
Can you jump back 2 slides?
2 slides.
There's a phrase you had about the data.
Sorry.
I had a question about kind of a hopeful question. The data discovery and classification, does that include any feature sets to automate, like finding where your existing data is, for say a federal client that has a whole host of assets and a really good understanding of their data profiles and their risk profiles, good understanding of their elements, but isn't accustomed to thinking about data consent?
Yeah.
Where the existing data they have relates to consent and will help them achieve that kind of, control.
Yeah, really good question. So, yes, but I also don't want to make it sound like a lot of people, when they hear data discovery and classification, they think silver bullet. It's going to solve all my problems, right? It solves a lot of problems, but especially when you think about privacy, you think about consent. Just because I found someone's data in a system doesn't mean it's there because I was only allowed to use it based on their consent, right? It could be there because, let me use an example. If you're finding that data in your HR system, like a Workday, right? We can go in, we can connect to Workday, we can discover and classify, tell you what data you have in Workday, but because that's an employee system, that data is probably not there based on consent, right? It's there because they're an employee and you have an employment contract and you have to have certain data on them to fulfill that employment contract. So there's often a layer of context that needs to be added. Data discovery and classification is very good at saying, this is what data you have where. There's often a context layer of why you have it. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can do that. We can imply the why based on the type of asset that it might have been found in, right? A lot of times, this is where a more manual assessment might take place as well. How do you ask somebody, why do you have this data? We can pre-populate, we can say, you have, this type of data on these types of people in this system. Pre-populate all that information, but, instead of me asking someone that question, you just have to ask them, okay, well, tell me a little bit why. So
does that mean your business units then would use those feature sets to kind of review and label and tag and then kind of incrementally build out your whole understanding?
Yeah, I mean, there's a
ton of data.
Yeah.
It's a little intimidating.
You're going to find there's a ton of data. We will generally see a thresholding-based approach. There's a lot of like confidence levels that are involved in discovery and classification. It's like, okay, we could say we're confident in this result, we're not confident in this result for whatever reason. You see a lot of that in unstructured data, right? Because if you discover a name in an unstructured file, a lot of times it's hard to know that that's a name. You got to have a lot of context around it to understand it. So there are certainly levels of review that go into this. There's a lot of things that don't have to be reviewed because you have a high confidence level. And it's also just like very dependent organization to organization as well. You mentioned financial company, very different from a retail company, things like that. So tons of automation involved there because it's even more difficult to ask somebody, hey, tell me all the data in your system, right? That's going to be wrong as soon as they tell you, and they probably don't know all of it. So it helps you get that full view, but there's definitely a validation and context piece as well. And I mean, look, that's just kind of the nature of the game, right? Like you need some level of, especially in privacy, like privacy is about people. You can't automate privacy compliance. Like there has to be an element of review and context and individual input into how you're doing that.
There's a need for human brilliance.
Yeah.
Part of them.
You can automate a lot of pieces of it, but fully automating that is, I think, it's not a silver bullet.
One more question. Can you repeat the question, Ryan?
Oh, yeah, I'm so
For
sorry.
virtual audience?
Discovering structured data is one thing. Unstructured data is a different challenge. Every organization has a boatload of unstructured data in the email system, in
Yep.
their inbound text contacts, their contact center. Their help desk gets screenshots of personal data
Yeah.
that somebody is submitting as part of a problem escalation. There's a wide range of
Video, audio,
yeah,
all kinds of stuff.
absolutely,
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about discovery and unstructured
Yeah.
data, please.
Of course. So, I mean, I think you framed it up well, right? There's often larger volumes of unstructured data that an organization has, right? So like you've got more of it that you have to scan and parse through, and then it's also just more difficult, depending on the type of data and the context of it, to be confident saying what you found within it, right? So I think those are the two challenges. With scale, I mean, scale, right? A lot of times it's about prioritization of like, where do you think the most sensitive information that you want to understand and go mitigate potentially like lives first. So you ultimately, just based on like infrastructure, are going to have to prioritize that. This is where, at least within our technology, we start to leverage like AI and machine learning a lot more because of the context, right? So again, the example, if I scan a document and I see Jordan could be a name, a river, a shoe, a country. You don't know until you reference the context of the rest of that document. So using that type of technology to bring context to the data and more accuracy is a method that we use to try to help with that. Another interesting unstructured data challenge that we're seeing is with the upcoming CPRA in the US includes employees into the scope of these rights, where it formerly only included consumers. Now, this is already a problem globally, like under the GDPR, but it's making a lot of US companies realize this, that if I get one of those requests to access or delete my data under the CPRA, an employee can now make that request. That request from a consumer looks a lot different than that request from an employee. And an employee might not be like an active employee, right? It might be a former employee with a grudge. It might be a prospective employee who didn't get a job. But much different, right? You start to have to think about, do I need to go scan through all their emails and like identify other people's personal information and redact it? Different level of scale, different types of challenges with even from like that single privacy requirement and unstructured data. So yeah, that's what we really focus on. Our technology is focused on all of that from really a personal data perspective. We go beyond that, but personal data is really where our expertise and background lies, and we have a lot of that regulatory intelligence as well as the AI technology to help do that. Sorry, I went too far.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, everyone, for attending the session. I would also like to thank the virtual audience for attending the session.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.